Good afternoon, everybody. This is the week 5 focus video for the spring of 2024 in MH510. This week we're going to be talking about consensus history and historians, and you're going to be producing your narrative history of the Boston Massacre. Update from the compound. Beautiful weather. Things are fine. Yeah, it's spring in Missouri and we're having a good time. So without further ado, we'll start talking about consensus history and consensus historians. Before I talk about the discussion questions, I just spent 3 hours on YouTube looking for videos about consensus history. In the past, I've spent time searching for books on the consensus historian. There's plenty of books on the progressives. There's plenty of books on von Ranke and his generation. There's plenty of books on the New Left. There's books being written about postmodernism in history. I've looked for journal articles that focus on consensus history as a school of history, and it's just not there. But the consensus school was the dominant school in American history from sometime in the late 1930s until sometime in the mid-1960s. Some of our greatest historians are members of what's known as the consensus school, but they didn't name themselves that. They were named by the New Left. So what is the consensus school? Real briefly in Doc's terms. The consensus historians were a group of historians who lived in a very tumultuous and crisis-filled period. That was their shaping experience. Was they were children during the First World War or in the immediate aftermath. They came of age in the Great Depression. Many of them served in World War II. They saw Nazism up front. And what was their reaction? Their reaction was to look back at American history with a big question in their minds. Why isn't America like Europe? Why did our history seem to take a different trajectory? Notice I said different trajectory, not necessarily better. They saw that Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries saw the mountaintop that they wanted to go to, and they shared that mountaintop. They shared that view. Where they differed was in the details. They differed about which trail to take to the top of that mountain. Slavery was a huge issue. That was the one really deeply contentious issue in American history, going back to the coming of the abolitionist school, which grew out of Quakerism, and New England Puritanism. The First Great Awakening had a lot to do with the rise of the anti-slavery movement. So it's a big argument in American history, but that's the only one. The other arguments we had were about how much we should increase the tariff. That was the big argument. If you read American history in the late 18th and 19th centuries, that's the dominant political question is, what should the tariff be? Where in Europe, you have these competing visions, not just of the mountaintop and how to get there. They had competing visions of which mountain to climb. And the American consensus historians saw that Americans saw the mountain. They had a pretty good common shared view of the mountaintop, and they differed on the path forward. That's the consensus school in Doc's mind in a nutshell. So let's move on to the discussion questions and the kind of backward thinking, or the background thinking rather, of how to approach these questions. And once again, I want to tell you, I'm not like trying to lead you to an answer. I'm trying to lead you through the sources and what questions to ask of the sources. And the answers you come up with are yours. So, first discussion question. The consensus school per se developed in the United States during the tumultuous years of about 1935 to 45 in response to the threats, both economic, political, and military, that the U.S. faced. But it draws on the older Romantic and nationalist schools of history in the 19th century. Other countries have produced similar schools. In fact, I could find videos on the British consensus, but I couldn't find them on the American consensus, that seek to identify the unifying and unique aspects of a nation's history. Based on your reading thus far in Arnold, Gaddis, Novick, Tosh, Truman, and Williams, discuss the three most significant characteristics of the consensus school, and what do you think the strengths of this approach are, and what weaknesses exist within the consensus and national school. Your second question is, who is Richard Hofstadter? Provide a one-paragraph biography and describe why he might be considered a consensus historian. I've got some links for you that talk about the consensus school. Most of them are fairly critical of it. I wonder why that is. And a piece on Richard Hofstadter himself. Consider, as you think about time and as you think about discussion question 1, the time and place of where these historians are writing from. What's going on in America? Who preceded the consensus school? Remember my basic idea that the nationalist school, the initial von Rankians in America, were seeking that which made us a nation. They were seeking that which unified us. And then the progressive historians began to pick that apart and look for what disunited us, or what we squabbled over. And now the consensus school comes, and they're again looking at what unifies us, and they'll be followed by the new left, which again looks at those things that we're not united about. Look at who the consensus historians really are. As you go through Novick especially, pick out some of the names, look them up very quickly, and just see who they are. Are they really conservatives, as most students often imagine? Or are they across the political spectrum? Is there a consensus among liberals and conservatives in the United States in this period about American history? What are the characteristics of the consensus school, and what are the strengths and weaknesses? Some other things to think about as you go through discussion question 1. The consensus is schooled by those who replace it, the new left. And remember Doc's theory that oftentimes schools that are named by their successors are kind of parodied and caricatured in those names. Sorry about all of those beeps, but my computer's doing strange things. The consensus historians were not seeking to create or impose a consensus. Rather, they saw more consensus than contention in America's past. They saw the same mountaintop. They just saw that we differed on the paths to that mountaintop. The consensus historians were looking back into American history and seeing the things that past Americans held in common. That compromise rather than conflict dominated the late 18th and 19th century, which was their emphasis, though they also recognized that there were issues of contention as well, specifically around slavery, abolition, and the Civil War being the principal exception to the American rule. The consensus historians are often accused of supporting American exceptionalism, but ask yourself, what did exceptionalism mean to the consensus historians? Does exceptionalism as used by the consensus historians mean excellent? Or does it mean an exception to the rule? In this case, the rule being the frequent and widespread civil unrest and revolution of late 18th and 19th century continental Europe. Okay. Discussion question 2. Who is Richard Hofstadter? Provide a one-paragraph biography and a description of why he is considered a consensus historian. Introductory paragraph of the thesis. Is he or is he not a consensus historian? Then write a one-page biography. Not a one-page, paragraph. Then, using the characteristics that you developed of consensus history, examine what you know about Hofstadter's approach to history. Demonstrate why you think he is or is not a consensus historian. Then there's a slide with a whole lot of pieces on Richard Hofstadter, including a couple pieces by him, I believe. All right. The narrative history. Several of you stubbed your toes with the primary source analysis. So let's make sure we understand what this assignment is about. Narrative histories are a staple of what the public encounters as history. In them, historians tell stories, obviously based on some use of evidence. For academic historians, the rigor required for research does not automatically mean that in the end, the story itself must be stale or unengaging. While research and analysis are the sine qua non of academic history production, in the end, we cannot spread the results of our work if it is something that people do not want to read or hear about. For this assignment, select sources only from the list on the last page. Using those sources, and more importantly, your analysis of 4 or 5 selected sources, do not turn in that primary source document analysis. Produce a 4 to 5 page, that's 1,350 words plus or minus 10%. I hate page counts. That conveys a narrative account of your topic. Naturally, you must balance the different perspectives and information conveyed in the sources to produce a coherent, readable story about the topic. For some examples, see the links in the slide. Not examples so much as how-tos. You must use proper citation in conformity with Chicago Manual of Style requirements. As a standard for the body text, use Times New Roman, 12-point font, double-spaced with 1-inch margins. Footnotes should be 10 points Times New Roman font and single-spaced throughout with a 1/2-inch indent on the first line. The bibliography should be 12-point Times New Roman font, single-spaced with a 6-point space between entries, with a 1/2-inch hanging indent for the first line. Don't forget the document naming convention in the instructor office, and see the rubric in the instructor office. Okay. That's the nuts and bolts. Theory, philosophy behind this assignment. This assignment is an artificial exercise. What I want you to imagine is that you've discovered a collection of documents referring to an event that no one else has ever written about before. You are the first to write about the Boston Massacre. Furthermore, suspend your memory for the duration of this exercise. You know only what is in the documents on the last page. So the only background and context is what you can draw from the documents themselves. And while some of these documents are titled witness statements or depositions, you can safely assume, therefore, that there was some subsequent investigation or trial. You do not have the transcript of the trial itself, nor any of the witness statements. Just describe the massacre itself. Do not concern yourself with the trial or the aftermath. For this assignment, select 4 or 5 primary sources from the Boston Massacre historical website and from the following slide. And I specify which ones to use from the Boston Massacre Historical Society website. Only the depositions or witness statements of the massacre itself are to be chosen. Do not use secondary sources. nor should you use some of the other primary sources listed. The Boston account or John Adams' closing argument are thus off limits. They're not witness accounts. They're not the people who were standing on that square watching what happened. Write this as a historian having just discovered this cache of documents. Do not create a fictional character to tell the story. Do not go source by source. Instead, write a flowing narrative weaving all the sources into a coherent narrative with a thesis, a whodunit, and a good conclusion and summary to bring it all together back at the end. The narrative analysis is due at 11:59 p.m. Sunday, the 31st of March, 2024, in the Week 5 Dropbox for Narrative History. That's all I've got for you this week. Y'all take care, stay safe, and I'll see you around the campus. Bye-bye.